Brilliant. Okay, I think that's working. Okay, it's 2 minutes past, so I think I'm just going to crack on. I've got quite a lot to get through this morning. So first of all, hello, thank you ever so much for joining me. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share this work with you. It's something that I feel incredibly passionate about. I think it's really important that we understand the influences on our decision making. And I think that we've got a responsibility to learn about and understand those influences as people who make decisions on a day-to-day basis that have really profound effects on people's lives. But before we get into that, I'll introduce myself. I'm Georgia Barnett. I'm a psychologist. I've been in the service for 20 years this year. I started off working in prisons before moving into HQ, and I've been in HQ for a long time now. And I'm part of the evidence-based practice team. So we're a team that tries to identify the best, most up-to-date research evidence that's relevant to the work of the agency and to bring that into the policies and practices of prisons, probation and youth custody. And I started this work, which focuses on fairness and effectiveness in decision making, to support the development of the HMPPS equality strategy back in 2017. I was reviewing the research into how different biases can affect human decision making, under what conditions we're more and less likely to be influenced by those biases, and then importantly, what we can do to mitigate the potential impact of bias on the outcomes of decisions. So I want to use this time that we've got here today to give a summary of what we've learnt about those things that can get in the way of good decision making, what we can do about that, and then to leave you with some questions that you can take away, which provide an opportunity to think about how that might apply to your practice, to the work that you do in your roles. So today's session is split into two main parts. The first bit is what you need to know about those things that can affect our decision making, specifically those biases that can undermine our ability to make fair, equitable decisions. And the second part introduces the main ways in which we can protect good and fair decision making. So what the evidence suggests makes the most difference to those outcomes. And then briefly at the end, I'm going to talk about what we're doing as an organisation about this, the resources that are available to you, and to leave you with those questions to take away and reflect on. Now, as I'm going through, please feel free to put the questions, any questions that you have, in the chat. I'm not terribly good at seeing what's going on in the chat at the same time as talking. So what I'm hoping is we'll have sufficient time at the end to go through some of those questions. But also anything that I don't get to, I'm really happy to follow up on after the session. And I've got my details on these slides, and I think we're going to make these slides available to everyone who attends too. So let's start with what we know about influences on decision making. Well, we know an incredible amount about this. So over the last 50 years, there's been huge advances in our understanding of how human beings make decisions. And it isn't just that we've got a lot of research in this area, it's that the research in this area is of an incredibly high quality. So as an example, Daniel Kahneman, who I'm sure some of you on this event will have heard of, he's one of the seminal researchers in this field. He won a Nobel Prize for his work in this area. So this work it's based on rigorous, careful, systematic, replicated research. It's not a flash in the pan. It's not what's fashionable at the moment. This is knowledge that has accumulated over time that we can be really confident in. And what that evidence base tells us is that we're not as rational as it used to be assumed that we were. So it was the case that we thought that people were mostly rational, reasoned decision makers, and economics was based on the idea that we were rational consumers, that we make our decisions about what to buy, about where to invest, what risks to take, how much and where to save, in a really logical, predictable way. But then consumer behaviour just didn't fit models based on the notion of the rational consumer. And actually, if you think about the purchases that you've made, how you've decided to spend your money, the investments you've made, the amount that you save, do you always make considered rational choices when it comes to finances and money? Have you ever made an impulse buy, big or small? And it's fairly likely that you have. I know that I certainly don't manage my finances in a way that I probably should. So a small group of psychologists decided to study how people made decisions involving money, tried to make sense of this discrepancy between this idea of kind of a rational consumer and then what consumers were actually doing. And what they discovered was a range of biases and mental shortcuts, which we commonly take when we're making those types of decisions. But then, as it turns out, as the research developed and started to look at other types of decisions, they found that actually there were biases that were relevant to pretty much any kind of decision that we as human beings make. So that research was the foundation of what's now known as behavioural economics, and really changed our understanding of how we operate as decision makers. And other research has since identified a wide range of biases which apply to all sorts of decisions, and they affect people of all different levels of intelligence, people of different ages, from different backgrounds, in different countries across the world. And what that tells us is that the use of mental shortcuts or rules of thumb, or sometimes called heuristics, and of biases, so tendencies towards a particular way of seeing things, or inclinations to prefer or give more weight to one thing over another, that's just a fundamental part of human decision making. And actually they're there for a reason. So these help us to make quick decisions and to make sense of a phenomenally complicated, constantly changing world. And they've also likely been instrumental in our survival as a species. So you're not meant to be able to read this next slide. For those of you who can't see it, it's basically a kind of a wheel of bias, and each spoke is a different bias that's been identified by research. But it's an illustration of just the sheer volume of biases that have been identified over that period of time. And these range from biases that help us to make predictions and find patterns in the world, to biases that decide what information we should pay attention to among the huge volume of information that comes into us through our senses. And I want to talk about 6 of these, which I think we need to be aware of as people working in or with the criminal justice system, for reasons that I hope will become clear. So the first bias I want to talk about is something called negativity bias. Now, this is a bias of memory. And what it means is that we remember negative events and behaviour more readily and more intensely. So we find it easier to remember negative events, and when we do remember them, they have more of an emotional impact on us than positive events and behaviour. And again, if you think about events that you find playing on your mind, it's likely that they're negative in nature. If you think about when you receive feedback, is it the positive stuff or is it the mild criticism that you end up focusing on? Now, there's a really good evolutionary reason put forward for this tendency that we have to focus on the negative. And that's that we're set up to pay attention to and to remember things that could be a threat to us, because that helps us to survive. So not just things that could be a physical threat, but also anything that's a threat to our sense of competence or our sense of belonging. So we've survived by being part of social groups. So we pay attention to and feel very affected by threat of being rejected. And that's all well and good when it comes to staying alive, but that can become problematic in our work. So it's something we're encouraged to engage in order to spot security threats or for public protection more generally, you know, keeping an eye out, never being complacent. But where it can hinder us is in making really thorough, fair assessments of people, or when we're assessing risk generally, because what it means is we might not be taking proper and full account of people's progress and evidence of positive behaviour. It's why catching good, sort of noticing the good that people are doing, can be so hard to do, and something we kind of have to force ourselves to do. It's not something that we're doing naturally all the time. It's also not so great for our psychological well-being when we're focusing really heavily on the negative. Then there's something called present bias. And this is an example of a bias that can interfere with our intentions. So present bias is our tendency to prioritise immediate short-term gains over longer-term, more abstract gains. And that can be at the detriment of our longer-term goals. So the example I always give when I'm talking about present bias getting in the way of intentions is that most of us will have an intention to be fit and healthy. because we know that in the short term, that's something that's going to benefit us, because if we're doing that, we're probably going to be mentally sharper. We're going to feel better about ourselves. In the longer term, we know that that's going to be good for us because it's associated with, you know, living a longer life and having a better quality of life in older age. But it's also something that's affected by decisions that we make, sometimes on a daily basis, which actually go against that intention or undermine that intention or don't fit with that goal. So, you know, we might make unhealthy choices at the end of a stressful day, even though it might be bad for us or it's going to make us feel worse in the long term. Even if we know that actually directly after we've eaten that second bar of chocolate, we're going to regret it, we still do it in the moment. And some of that can be down to present bias. And it's because we're prioritising the immediate comfort and ease of that unhealthy choice over the longer term benefits of the choice that requires more effort. So, you know, we come back from a long day at work, a difficult day, and rather than spending, you know, half an hour cooking a sort of healthy, nutritious meal, we might reach for a takeaway menu. Rather than putting on our gym stuff and going out for a run, we might sit on the sofa and put Netflix on. Rather than having an in-depth conversation with somebody about how we're feeling, we might pour ourselves a glass of wine, for example. And some of that can be explained by present bias. And that sort of bias towards that kind of immediate gratification, that was adaptive, because for millions of years we lived in an environment in which food and rest was hard to come by. So we had to eat and rest when we could. We're set up to conserve our resources because that conferred an advantage when it came to survival. But now, in the present day, in modern day life, which is characterised by sedentary lifestyles and a more calorie dense diet, that's become more problematic, and that's something that can get in the way of us in achieving those intentions to be fit and healthy. So why am I talking about this in relation to the work that we do in HMPPS? Well, because present bias can help to explain, or it might be one part of the reason why we might put off having difficult conversations, why we might avoid topics that we feel uncomfortable with, like talking about difference or challenging someone, why we might avoid starting a task that we think is going to require a lot of us, that we think we're going to find really hard, that's really complex, you know, in favour of doing something that we can do quickly and easily and makes us feel good. So it's not always a problem, but it can be a problem if it gets in the way of our intentions. The next bias that I want to talk about is confirmation bias. And I think it's really important that we're all really aware of our tendency towards confirmation bias, because I think it's so prevalent that as I started looking into these different biases and reflecting on my own decision making, this is one that I feel the pull towards just all the time, and I see it in other people too. So confirmation bias is our tendency to look for evidence that confirms our existing beliefs. And disconfirmation bias, it's kind of sister bias, means that we avoid, we minimise, we disregard information or evidence that doesn't support the way that we see things. So if you think about, a new set of statistics that's issued by the media, you can pretty well, oh, there's an interesting noise that's just popped up. Could everyone just make sure that they're on mute, please? Thank you. If you think about when stats are kind of issued, you can pretty well predict who it is who's going to accept those statistics and share them widely, and that's the people whose view those statistics support. You can also predict who is it who's going to scrutinise, find fault, pick holes in those statistics, and that's actually those people who those statistics, whose beliefs they don't support. So why do we have this tendency? Why is that adaptive? Well, there's a couple of reasons. So we're motivated to see ourselves as being right about things. So from a psychological perspective, we need to feel competent. We need to feel like we've got things in hand. But we also want to have certainty in our beliefs. We want to have certainty that the way that we see the world is the right way of seeing the world, because actually that makes us feel safe. And one of the reasons that traumatic events can be so disturbing is that they can shake our confidence in our understanding of the world and undermine our trust in our own judgment, in the way that we see things. And if you can't trust your own judgment about what's safe and what's not, how can you hope to keep yourself safe in the future? So lacking faith in one's own judgment can be a really difficult place to be psychologically. So confirmation bias helps us to feel certain about our judgments. It helps us to feel competent. But clearly that can, and it does at times, get in the way of our ability to critically appraise our own thinking, to see the whole picture, and to be fair and effective decision makers. The fourth bias I want to talk about is fundamental attribution bias. Now, this refers to our tendency to attribute other people's actions to something fundamental about them. So we think people's behaviour tells us something about who they are as a person, and we underestimate the extent to which the situation that someone's in influenced their behaviour. But what's interesting is that we tend to do this less when we're judging our own behaviour. And I'll give a personal example, and this is about driving. So if I'm driving and I make a mistake, you know, nothing sort of massively dangerous, but if I make a sort of minor mistake, I forget to put my indicator on at the right time, or I haven't checked my blind spot properly before I pull out, the way in which I might explain that to myself is that I might say, oh gosh, my attention wandered for a second, or the kids were screaming in the back and I was distracted, or I'm really tired today, or maybe, you know, that person was going too fast, they came out of nowhere. Okay, so I might think about some of the situational influences on that behaviour, on that mistake that I made. If someone else makes a mistake that affects me when I'm driving, if someone, you know, cuts me up on a roundabout, for example, then I'm much less likely to explain that. Certainly, you know, straight away, my kind of initial response to that is not to go straight to those situational explanations. I'm much more likely to think that that behaviour says something about the type of person that that driver is, the type of driver that they are, that they're careless, that they're a bad driver, that they shouldn't be on the road. And that's a, you know, fairly sanitized version of what might be going on in my mind. But the point is that I'm much more likely to think that that behaviour says something fundamental about that person. When it comes to me making a similar mistake, I'm much more likely to take into account the situation that I was in that could help to explain why I made that mistake. Why is that relevant to us and our work? Well, it means, for example, if I see someone as high risk of reoffending, and I see them as a kind of a bearer of that risk, so that goes with them wherever they go, then I might underestimate the impact of protective factors and situational influences on reducing that person's risk. Conversely, if I see someone as low risk of reoffending, I might fail to see, or I might underestimate the impact of a changing situation on the escalation of that person's risk. Also, if we're weighting situational influences too heavily in ourselves, then we might miss opportunities to reflect on our own behaviour in a way that's most conducive to learning. So saying, you know, well, that's about the situation, that's not something about me that I need to work on. We also follow something called the familiarity principle. So we tend to feel more positive about situations, people, groups of people that are more familiar to us. Because if something's familiar to us, it means it's proved itself, or they've proved themselves, not to be a threat. We've survived an encounter with them before and come out the other side. So we feel comfortable and positive about familiarity. We're much more wary and more negative about situations, about people, about groups of people that we're not familiar with. And there's also this thing called affinity bias, which means we feel more positive about people that we have an affinity with, who we feel that we share something important with. It might be we've grown up in the same area, we know some of the same people, or we see some of ourselves in that person. We tend to judge them more positively. And the familiarity principle, affinity bias, these clearly have implications for the sorts of judgments that we make about people who come from groups that we're less or we're more familiar with. We also compare ourselves to other people. And again, that's kind of an important mechanism that we employ to help us to feel competent and worthy. But we have something that's called an in-group bias, which means that we tend to see the groups that we belong to as having more positive attributes than out-groups, so groups that we don't see ourselves as belonging to. And our line of work means that we make judgments about people all the time. And I don't think we're always sufficiently switched on to these biases and the impact that they can have on our thinking. And then finally, where there are gaps in our knowledge about people, we can also rely on learned stereotypes to fill in those gaps, particularly when people come from groups that we're not very familiar with. And I don't think I need to go into why stereotyping is bad for fair decision making, for effective decision making. But one thing you might ask is, how can we have all of these biases? How can these be so fundamental to how we operate and make sense of the world without knowing about them or without seeing them in ourselves? And this is where it can help to understand a bit more about how we make decisions and the systems that we use to do this. So Daniel Kahneman, who I mentioned earlier, he says that decision making can be best understood as occurring in two systems. So system one is really fast, efficient, effortless, automatic. So as I mentioned earlier, again, we're set up to expend the least effort required to conserve our resources wherever possible. So in many situations, system one lets us do that. It enables us to do that with little cost. It uses mental shortcuts, it relies on biases, and sometimes that's absolutely fine. And system one can be really helpful. But in some situations, those mental shortcuts or biases can have a negative impact. They can take us away from what it is that we want to achieve. It's that fast, intuitive nature of the processing in system one that means that biases and mental shortcuts are able to exert such an influence on system one thinking. And that doesn't mean that all decisions that are made in system one will be biased, but it does mean that some definitely will be, because it relies on some of those in order to do such efficient decision making, such quick decision making. System two, on the other hand, is much slower. It's more deliberate. It's a conscious process which is logical and reasoned. It requires significant effort. It's based on rules and knowledge and reflection, but it can also be subject to bias. So, you know, as an example, we can, and we do, carefully and consciously explain away evidence that doesn't fit with our existing beliefs, and we gather and give more weight to that which does, which is that confirmation bias. But generally speaking, we're much less likely to be influenced by bias in system two than we are in system one. And system two is a system in which we have an opportunity to critically appraise our thinking and to spot where biases might be influencing our decisions. So we might like to think that when we're in system two, or that we are in system two, when we're making decisions at work, you know, certainly when we're making important decisions that affect other people. But the fact is that we are set up to use system one wherever possible. That's the system we operate in for the majority of the time, our kind of default system. And there are also certain situations or factors that make system one thinking much more likely. So research suggests that we're more prone to bias in certain situations. There are factors which make us more prone to biased thinking. And there are three key factors that seem to compromise decision making and they exert a really strong influence on decision making, make it much more likely that we're going to be influenced by bias. Now, the first of these is tiredness. When we're tired, we look for quick solutions. We don't monitor our decisions as well. We're less likely to spot errors than we are when we're well rested. So we go for the system that requires the least resources. That's system one thinking. So when we're tired, much more likely to go into system one thinking. Our emotions have a real impact on our decision making, and there's some really interesting research about the influence of different emotions on our judgment. But in particular, stress can have a profound impact on decision making ability. So when we're stressed, what you see is an increase in activity in the limbic system. in our brain. So that's the part of the brain that's responsible for sort of social and emotional processing. It deals with threat. And at the same time, we see a decrease in activity in the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex behind the forehead and eyes, which is the bit of the brain that's responsible for what psychologists call kind of higher level executive functions. So these are things like consequential thinking and perspective taking and planning ahead and projecting into the future, and being able to put your decision into context and think things through. The bit of the brain that's really involved with system 2 thinking. So when we're stressed, the bit of the brain that's really involved with system 2 thinking is much less accessible to us. We're much more likely to operate in the part of the brain that's more closely associated with system 1 thinking, with making quick decisions that require little of us. Also, if we're distracted or overwhelmed, so maybe the volume or complexity of information that's coming at us it feels really overwhelming, and that can mean that we can make poorer decisions because we might be relying on system 1 to make a quick and intuitive decision to get us out of that uncomfortable situation. So researchers in this area talk about improving decision readiness as a way of improving decision making. So we are decision ready when we're well rested, when we have all of the information that we need in a form that makes sense to us, when we're trained to make the decision, when we have the time and the space that we need to make that decision, and when we're calm and we're not distracted, so we can focus on that decision and that decision alone. And that's fairly far from the situation I think most of us find ourselves on a day-to-day basis when we're making some pretty important decisions. It can be really hard to achieve in the real world when there are demands for, you know, very quick turnaround on reports, when information is scant, when people are in highly charged situations. So I think it's safe to say that we often work in a less than ideal decision-making environment. And again, that doesn't mean that every decision that we make outside of those sort of ideal conditions will be influenced by these biases, but it does mean that we would absolutely expect some of them to be. So, which decisions at work could this affect? Well, we've been thinking about how this might apply to HMPPS decisions, and we've got a list here. Now, which of these are made in poor or less than ideal decision-making environments? Actually, you can go through and look at any one of those and pick out factors that would influence those particular decisions which are far from ideal. So, you know, look at use of force. Lots of those decisions will be made in system 1, you know, out of necessity. People are in threatening, highly charged situations which require quick decisions. You know, it wouldn't do to sit and do a kind of cost benefit analysis before you're reacting. And again, it doesn't mean that all of those decisions will be biased, but it means that some of them will absolutely have been influenced by different biases at different points. Pre-sentence report recommendations. So in particular, we've been looking at on-the-day reports because they're written under acute time pressure and people have limited information. So, you know, again, less than ideal decision-making conditions. Complaints. You know, people are trying to respond to those while doing their day job. They're juggling different demands. They don't have a great deal of time to be able to concentrate on that and that alone. So I've been working with the policy leads to look at where in some of these processes there may be particular vulnerabilities to bias and what we can do about that. And lots of our policies and processes have been developed, and lots of our individual practices too, to counter the influence of biases, to increase consistency, to increase objectivity. You know, we're not starting from scratch here. But what's interesting is the concept of defensibility, because in practice, what that sometimes means is that in pursuit of defensibility, we've got systems and processes that actually support or encourage confirmation bias. So that ask people to articulate and justify decisions that they've already come to identify and then explain away counter evidence, and that don't challenge us to seriously consider alternative outcomes. So there is definitely room for improvement in what we're doing. So I just want to pause and ask you to reflect for a moment on which decisions you think could be affected by bias. And again, I'm not saying every decision that you make under less than ideal decision making conditions is going to be biased, but which decisions could be vulnerable to the influence of bias? And just to pop a couple of those in the chat. Anyone think of anything? It might be just that list that I put up on the previous slide is one that rings true. Okay, so enforcement, reporting frequency, so some kind of probation-based decisions. Risk of harm and ROSH, yeah, absolutely. So decisions where you're having to make judgments with a focus on looking at risk, so that it might feed into, or negativity bias could come into some of those decisions. Also, you might not have all of the information available to you that you would want to be able to make a really full and comprehensive decision. Accommodation, placements, and I think any decisions that you've got to make under real time pressure. Yeah, adjudications where people are trying to get through 20 plus in a morning. Yeah, staff recruitment decisions. And yeah, when that comes to like facilitator selection as well, absolutely. That's where things like affinity bias can come into play. And recalls and breaches, definitely. Again, huge pressure, often sort of a real urgency associated with making those sorts of decisions. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think what we know is that as human beings, and human beings that work in less than ideal decision-making environments, some of our decisions are vulnerable to the influence of these biases. So then the question then is, well, what can we do about it? And that's where the evidence about something that's called, or sometimes called, debiasing decision-making comes into play. And so this is less mature than the evidence on influences on decision making, but it's growing and there's enough of it and it's of good enough quality to point to strategies that seem to make a difference. So just to say a little bit about what debiasing is and isn't. So what it's about is about correcting those kind of systematic biases in decision making, about trying to intervene and make less likely the impact of bias on decision making, or improve the decision making process so that it's more robust, more resilient to the influence of bias. But it's also about helping people to achieve their intentions to be fair and consistent in their decision making. So it's not about changing intentions and tackling explicit biases or prejudices. So it's much more about for those people who want to be fair, who want to be non-discriminatory, which I think is the overwhelming majority of people working in HMPPS. I think one of the reasons we get attracted to working in criminal justice is because actually we hold fairness as such a core value. Debiasing is about how do we create the right environments, how do we give people the right tools, how do we equip ourselves with the right knowledge to make sure that we're least likely to be influenced by these biases that could interfere with our ability to operate in a way that's in line with that value of fairness that we hold really dearly. So what are the strategies that work? Now, there are three main types of strategy that work to reduce the impact of bias on decisions. And the first are those that help people to move from that automatic intuitive decision making system 1, to the more deliberate, effortful, considered system 2 decision making. So these are things that kind of slow people down and prompt people to use more conscious effort in decision making, to be more reflective. So this can be things like asking other people to review our decision. It might be using a checklist to slow things down and to make sure that we take into account all of the relevant evidence for a decision. And I think checklists are a really interesting one because I think they can be experienced as almost sort of deprofessionalizing, like it's taking something away from us and our professional judgment. But actually the evidence around checklists is really strong. So in medicine, for example, checklists have just been transformative. So there's an American surgeon called Atul Gawande, and he was part of a group of surgeons who pioneered this surgical checklist, and they rigorously tested it. And it's a 12-item checklist for people who are in operating theatres about to do some surgery. And it's a really sort of simple checklist. It took them quite a while to make sure they had exactly the right things on there, sort of, to test and iterate and make sure that it was as impactful as it could be. But the very first item on that checklist is just making sure that the person who needs the operation is the person who's on the table in front of you. So it's not, it's not hugely sort of complex cognitive tasks that they're asking of people. It's pretty straightforward stuff. And given that, in that environment, you're dealing with highly trained, highly professional people who are really invested in getting the right outcome. This very simple, straightforward checklist actually had a huge impact. So there are studies that suggest that it's reduced the number of deaths as a result of complications from surgery by 40%. And that checklist has been now sort of rolled out. I think there's over 50 countries across the world that are using that checklist. And that's because even though those people are highly trained and highly motivated to do the right thing, they're also working in an environment which means they are far more vulnerable to biases in thinking, far more vulnerable to making errors in their decision making because of the conditions under which they're making those decisions. Also, making people accountable for their decisions, in the right circumstances. I think there's also something to be said for not sort of layering loads of bureaucracy on decision making and then reducing the time available that people have to engage in their work and to think about their decisions. That's sort of not what we want to do, but making people accountable for their decisions where appropriate can also work to promote slower and more deliberate reasoning, more critical appraisal and self-reflection, because we know that if we have to explain our decisions to someone else, then that's actually an incentive to use more resources, move into system 2 thinking. It also says something about the value that we place on that decision, I think. Also, considering counter evidence is a good way to counter what's called narrow thinking, so a tendency to focus on only one or two explanations or options. But if we want to counter confirmation bias, then the best strategy is to articulate the best argument for the opposite decision to the one that you first came to, or an alternative decision to the one that you first come to. And that is really effective. And that's actually a strategy that we're trialling across 14 courts in England and Wales as part of the pre-sentence report pilot that the Ministry of Justice is running. So this is in on-the-day reports where we've been testing whether or not this kind of consider the opposite strategy, so asking report writers to come up with an alternative sentencing recommendation to the one that they initially sort of reach for, whether or not that can make a difference to the recommendations that are put forward to the courts. There's the sort of second set of strategies. It's really about changing the environment so that system 1 thinking leads to better results. So there are a couple of ways in which we can do this. So some of it's about thinking about how information is presented to people so that it's easy to understand, it's readily available, it's complete, it's framed in a way that makes sense to people. That can make a real difference, just making sure people have what they need when they need it in a form that makes sense to them. Also, having a more diverse workforce helps to reduce social group biases. So what it means is that what you need to have is for people from different social groups to be working together collaboratively towards a common goal. And those people from different social groups need to have equal status. And under those conditions, those are called the conditions of intergroup contact, you see real reductions in any kind of social group biases. So biases against people from social groups that differ to the one that you, or the ones that you see yourself as belonging to. The third type of strategy It's sometimes called a kind of an organisational fix. It's about correcting biases at the organisational rather than at the kind of individual decision maker level. So that can work really well for complex judgments. Ooh, I seem to have gone backwards for some reason. So that can work really well for complex judgments. I'm going to sync to, I don't know what's happened here. Another user took control. Oh, there we go. Sorry, my slides jumped about there. So this can work really well when you're looking at things or decisions where there can be a lot of noise, where there can be lots of information that's kind of competing for your attention, and the way in which you prioritise that information is affected by the experiences that you've had, by the beliefs that you hold, those sorts of things. And that introduces a lot of kind of variation into the decision-making process. It means that you might have one person looking at the same sort of information and coming up with a completely different judgment to someone who's looking at the same information but actually has a different take on it. And that's why things like our risk of reoffending predictors can be really helpful. Those kind of structured, statistically derived tools which consistently outperform kind of expert judgment can be really helpful in reducing some of that noise and in making it less likely that those judgments are going to be influenced by biases. But with any of those tools, we need to be really careful that the information going into them isn't biased in the first place, and that we have systems in place to check the outcomes of those assessments, to spot mistakes or areas for improvement. Checklists can also be a form of organisational fix. They can be reviewed socially, and they can lead to kind of group-based decisions, which can be less likely to be biased if those groups consist of the right people. So you've got the kind of slowing things down type strategies, providing kind of an interrupter to the decision-making process, asking other people to check your thinking and your decision-making, using checklists, considering the opposite, considering alternatives. You've got the ones that work on creating a better decision-making environment. And then you've got the ones which are about taking things away from the individual and giving them over to groups, or using decision-making tools or algorithms which can help to reduce some of those biases in the right situation. And another way of thinking about this is by thinking about what we can do for our people, what we can do culturally, what activities we can ask people to do, and what kind of environments we're creating. So the things that we can do for our people, we can recruit and retain a diverse workforce at all levels of the organisation. We can also keep our staff well because we know what impact stress has on decision making. It's also obviously the right thing to do. We can give people the right training and get people with the right skills and knowledge for the decisions that they're asked to make into role. We can also pay attention to our organisational culture, and we can normalise reflection and discussion of biases in thinking. We can model this. We can help people see this as the right and the professional thing to do, alongside things like help seeking and asking for other perspectives. So we can cultivate and encourage an openness to learning. We can engage in activities that can help to reduce the influence of bias in our decisions too, like using checklists to standardise practice and improve consistency, using decision-making tools, using formal or informal supervision to challenge our thinking and our judgments. And then we can pay attention to the decision-making environment, making sure that our decision makers, as far as possible, have what they need when they need it in a form that makes sense. They have the time and the space to make those decisions. And then we can also make sure that we're adhering to the principles of procedural justice. So, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but we can also make sure that we're thinking about how we communicate the outcomes of the decisions that we're making, because we know that that has a real influence on how fairly people feel treated, which is just because we engage in a process that should reduce bias and should be fair and should be effective doesn't mean that people will automatically feel like they're being treated in a way that's fair and objective and neutral. So we need to have an eye on both things. We also know from research a bit about those things that don't make a difference to how to levels of bias in decision making, or that can actually sort of perversely make us more biased in our thinking. Now, the first of these is raising awareness, which may seem ironic because that's kind of what this session is about, that this session is about helping to raise some awareness and then hopefully to direct you to things that you will be able to do differently as a result. But generally speaking, so education about bias isn't particularly effective, and levels of general education, so the kind of education you get in school and you know, after school, that can make a difference in reducing the presence or influence of some types of biases, in particular, you know, numeracy and kind of probability estimates, for example, but doesn't have much of an impact on other types of biases. So the kind of education that does seem to make a difference to whether or not decisions are influenced by bias are decision-specific education. So when people are trained in the rules for making a certain type of decision, and then they have the opportunity to put those rules into practice and to correct themselves in response to feedback on their performance soon after the training, and to be able to do that frequently thereafter. But that only works when people can then, following the training, spot that they need to put that education into practice, and when they're motivated to do that, when they're not being pulled in lots of different directions and have lots of different priorities that might crowd that out. So it's not good for people who don't know, can't spot those opportunities, who aren't alert to those opportunities, or who aren't motivated to scrutinise their decision making. So what we need to do is we need to move beyond awareness or education to building opportunities and capability to do things differently. Research also tells us a bit about what can make things worse. So, for example, telling people that they have to comply with anti-prejudice policies. So there was a really good quality study that found that pressurising people to comply with anti-prejudice policies had the perverse effect of increasing both implicit and explicit, and in this case they were looking at racial bias. So researchers compared different types of anti-prejudice message, and they found that people exposed to messages which were compelling them to comply with policies designed to reduce prejudice had higher levels of both explicit and implicit prejudice after reading those messages than they did before. And that was in contrast to people who were exposed to messages which were highlighting the value of reduced prejudice, of what these policies were intended to do, what the benefits were of these policies for them and for everyone and for the organisation, why it was important and worthwhile. People who were exposed to those sorts of messages had lower levels of prejudice than before they were given those messages. And the researchers suggest that that finding can be explained by something that's called psychological reactance. Now, psychological reactance refers to the phenomenon that our ability to choose how we think, how we feel, how we act is so fundamentally important to us as human beings that if we feel like that is being threatened in some way, that we can become really angry and hostile and defiant and dig our heels in, basically. Other studies have found that getting people to think of themselves as objective decision makers just before making a decision can actually increase potentially discriminatory decisions by increasing a reliance on stereotypical beliefs. So there were a series of really well-designed experiments which looked at the impact of priming people to see themselves as objective on hypothetical decisions to hire male or female job applicants. So they found that feeling more objective actually made people more subjective in their decision making, and that effect was more pronounced among people who held more stereotypical beliefs about men and women. And what the researchers concluded was that when people believe that they're not biased, so when they're telling themselves I'm objective, I'm an objective decision maker, not easy to say, they are more likely to fail to question their automatic thoughts, which might be based on stereotypical beliefs, and assume that that intuition is a valid and appropriate basis on which to make decisions. And other researchers demonstrated the same thing with regard to age. So priming people to think of themselves as objective increased age discrimination in hiring. So I think that's quite an interesting concept. On the one hand, we want to make sure that people and that we validate that people hold fairness as a core value, because we're likely to act in a way that aligns with our values. That's something that tends to be important to us as human beings. We find it very difficult if we act in a way that doesn't align with those values. So on the one hand, we want people to, we want to reinforce, yes, we know that fairness is important to you, but on the other hand, we don't want to give the message that because fairness is important to you, you are always going to be an objective decision maker, because that's just simply not true. None of us are. We're human beings. We're going to rely on these biases, and those are sort of outside of our conscious awareness a lot of the time. So it's about recognizing that we value fairness, and that because we value fairness, we are open to and alert to the potential influence of bias on our decisions. We need to hold those two things at the same time. So what can we do as individuals and as line managers? This slide basically just sums up what we've covered so far. So for ourselves, we can use decision-making tools, things like checklists, tools that are available to us, structured risk assessments, those sorts of things, to slow down our thinking. We can make sure that we're considering all relevant information when making a decision. We can consider the opposite of our initial judgment, or we can consider a viable alternative. We can ask ourselves, what would be the best argument I can come up with for that alternative decision? We can ask someone else to review our decision, because we're likely to pay more attention and more effort, and also just to get a different perspective on it, to see whether or not we might be falling into the trap of confirmation bias, for example. And we can talk openly about the potential for bias to influence our decision making, and make that commitment to reviewing decisions and decision making processes to tackle bias. And we can also make sure that we're looking after ourselves and paying attention to our well-being, because stress absolutely affects the way that we make decisions. And so if we value good decision making, we should value ourselves and want to look after ourselves generally anyway, but also if we value our decision making, then that's a really powerful way of sort of protecting better decision making and making it less likely we're going to be influenced by biases. And similarly, if we want to support our staff in decision making, we can ask them to make the argument for an alternative judgment to the one they've come to. We can really keep an eye out for that confirmation bias, particularly when we're under time pressure. We can make sure that they have the time that they need to make important decisions. We can encourage people to check that biases aren't playing a role in their decision making. We can make sure people have the information that they need. It's all about creating that decision making environment that's most likely to mean that they don't have to fill in gaps or don't have to rely on mental shortcuts in order to make decisions. We can have assurance processes to encourage people to put effort into decisions and to spot possible biases. We can have a more diverse workforce at all levels of the organisation. We can use policies, decision-making tools, checklists to make sure people consult all the relevant evidence prior to making decisions. We can use review panels where appropriate, and we can pay attention to and support the well-being of our staff. We can also pay attention to not only what we do, so debiasing decision making, the strategies that I've talked about, they're about what we do to try and create a decision making process that is least likely to be influenced by bias, that's most likely to be fair and objective and consistent and effective. But we also know that we really need to pay attention to how fairly people feel treated by those processes. We need to make sure people feel like they have a voice in decisions that are made about them that affect them. We need to be transparent about the things that we're doing to try to protect those decisions from bias, protect that neutrality. We also need to make sure that we are taking issues seriously, helping people feel heard and seen, and reinforcing that the people that these decisions are being made about, that they matter, and that they've played a big part. What matters to them has played a part in your thinking. And also that we're communicating with sincerity and care the trustworthiness of our motives, because those things, when people feel fairly treated, which, as I said before, just because a system that we have is designed in order to make fair and effective decisions, that doesn't necessarily mean that people will feel like that system is being employed fairly, or that they've been treated fairly by that system. We need to make this effort to focus on how fairly people are feeling treated, because that affects how they feel about the outcome, how they feel about the decision, how likely they are to comply with that decision. And those 4 principles are called the principles of procedural justice, and they have a really big influence on the degree to which people feel like the decision-making authority is legitimate, the organisation is legitimate, and how they feel about complying with the outcome of that decision. So we need both things. So what I wanted to leave you with, to take away, is to have a think about the decisions that you or your staff make that could be vulnerable to biases, to start to have a think about all the different decisions that might be made in less than ideal decision making conditions that could be vulnerable to some of the different biases that I've talked about today. So negativity bias, affinity bias, confirmation bias, that fundamental attribution bias. All of these different things, could they play a role in some of the decisions that you or your staff make on a day-to-day basis? Also, to think about what you do that works well to protect those decisions from bias. So what are you doing at the moment that fits with the evidence that I've talked about? Because again, we're not starting from scratch here. There will be things that you're doing that you want to make sure that you continue to do, or that you want to do more of, or that you want to spread to other decisions. And then what else could you be doing? Where are the gaps? Where are there still vulnerabilities? Which of these other strategies might you be able to bring to bear on those decisions? And there are a number of things that we're doing at the moment to try to bring this evidence into what we're doing as an agency. So I mentioned the research that we're doing in courts. We're also developing training on this issue as part of a sort of broader look at diversity and inclusion training across the agency. We're feeding into the race action programme and making sure that this evidence is feeding into the different projects that are part of that programme. This evidence is feeding into the development of a digital tool that supports recall decision making, and also there's a huge programs of work around what are called human factors and biases and mental shortcuts, and the way in which we make decisions is one of those, or some of those human factors, and high reliability programs of work in prisons, probation and youth custody, which is all about understanding the influence of situational factors on safety critical decisions, on how we understand and respond to safety risks. So this work, it's all part of that too, and there's going to be there are prison pilots that are going on at the moment which are testing checklists and how those can help in surfacing safety risks and responding to safety risks in prisons. There's work that's going to be going on in probation, looking at this in a different context, looking at serious further offending, also systems, also looking at investigations in headquarters, and there are plans to tie this into the culture work that's going on with youth custody service. There are a number of resources that are available from the evidence-based practice team that are either in development or that are ready for people to use, and we're developing some short videos as part of work with the Race Action programme, which talk about how different biases might influence certain policies that are being relaunched, and what it is within those policies that would help to protect against the influence of those biases. So you have to watch out for those coming up. Ooh. And that's a very whistle stop. So I realise I've talked for such a long time. I'm so sorry. What I will do is, if anyone has any questions about what I've talked about, please get in touch with me. So I'm just georgia.barnett@justice.gov.uk. There's a lot of work going on in this area, but there is so much more that we could do. I feel like this can just apply to so much of the work that we do across the agency, both as individuals and you know, as an organisation. So if you're interested in this, if this is something that rings, you know, this chimes with you, then please get in touch. If you feel like you can see that there's an opportunity to apply some of this to practice, then please do get in touch with me. And I'm so sorry about not leaving enough time for Q&A. I didn't realise how much I've been chatting away, but thank you so much. I've got Jacqueline. You've got a quick question?
I might have missed, but are you sending out the slides?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk to the people who are organising this about the best way of doing that, but definitely I'll make those available, and this whole session is going to be recorded as well, and that's going to be available to people beyond those who've attended this session as well. So if you wanted to share it with other people, that would be possible. Thank you. I'm so sorry for running out of time for questions. When I practiced, I had a good 10 minutes at the end, but sorry. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.